Truck drivers, what's a creepy story you've got from the middle of nowhere? Not sure if this story's creepy, but it's definitely scary. My father was a truck driver in East Africa in the 80s and early 90s. During the years leading up to the Rwanda genocide, my father was passing through Rwanda. He reached a checkpoint and was forcibly removed from his truck at gunpoint. Apparently he looked like he belonged to the Tutsi tribe, and they put him in a cage with other Tutsi prisoners. He tried communicating that he isn't Rwandan, but no one spoke the same language as him. Every night they would take about 5 people from the cage and slaughter them in front of him. After the third night, he saw a man that spoke a little bit of Swahili, which my dad spoke, and told him that he's not Rwandan, and showed him his ID. Somehow the guy got him out, and he was handed the keys to his truck and was on his way. Yikes. When you really look into it, Africa can be a pretty messed up place. I was driving through eastern Washington on some state roads. There were no rest stops or cities, but I had done the route enough to know that there were these massive dirt areas every 40 or so miles where you could park safely away from the road. I decided to call it a night and closed my blinds and laid down to watch something on my phone. After roughly an hour, I hear someone try to open the driver's side door. I haven't heard any vehicles on the road the whole time I'm parked, but I get up to peek out the curtains. As I'm looking out into the blackness of the driver's side window, I hear them try the passenger side door. I peek down from the top of the curtain, but can't see anything, so I start the truck and kick on the lights. I'm fairly freaked out at this point, so I'm still not opening the curtains, but peeking through gaps. Nothing. Nobody is standing near either of my doors or parked within sightline. I take a deep breath and close the sleeper curtains too, because for some reason that's going to make things better, right? After laying back down and convincing myself that something blew against the truck and it only sounded like the doors, it was fairly windy outside and a lot of flat ground, I hear what sounded like someone trying to pry open the vents of the sleeper. The door handles start clicking again, and the truck starts shifting like someone is climbing on it. I hit the little alarm button in the sleeper, hoping to spook them off, but it does nothing but add to the noise of door handles, fingers tapping on windows and chassis, and the hiss of air coming out of the suspension. Then suddenly it stops. A few moments when I can only hear myself breathing and my heart pounding before I hear another truck approaching, then drive by. I spent the next few hours waiting for whatever it was to come back, but it never did. In the morning I couldn't find any footprints or damage to my truck, but on every window were tiny human-looking handprints, like a toddler had licked their hand and stuck it to my window over and over. You know, everyone talks about looking for Bigfoot out in the woods, but what if there's also a Smallfoot somewhere out there? He'd probably be a lot harder to see, but maybe that was him. Driving through an abandoned section of Baltimore at 3 in the morning, my CB radio turned itself on and crackled for a bit. Out of nowhere, some voice over the radio said in a deep southern drawl, "I ain't got no panties on." I could see up and down the interstate for miles, and saw not one set of headlights. Well, it sounds like you got some very odd and useless information from whatever ghost was in the area. My dad drove a truck between Edinburgh and London, and tells me this story often. He was driving down the motorway and looked to his right. Saw a woman with a Miss Trunchbull bun, as he describes it, staring at him with a terrified expression from a car next to him. Before he really knows how to react, the car pulls off at the next exit, and my dad, although shaken, carries on. About half an hour later, a different car with a different driver pulls alongside my dad, with the same woman in the passenger seat, with the same expression on her face. My dad thinks, F this, and plans to pull into the next services to report, as even if it's nothing or a misunderstanding, better to be safe than sorry, right? Anyway, the car disappears before he can get any details, and he thinks there is no point calling the police with no details, so he carries on driving. Literally about 4 hours later, almost in London, yet another car pulls alongside him with the same woman, same Miss Trunchbull hair, same terrified expression, except this time she appears to be screaming at my dad through the window. So my dad pulls over into a lobby and calls the police. Apparently, they have received 3 other calls about the same woman and car in the same area in the last few minutes. It is unfortunately anticlimactic as he never heard anything more about it, but he didn't see her again, and although he kept an eye on the news, didn't see anything about it. Hopefully it's just a giant coincidence, who knows. Well, I don't really know what's so coincidental about a woman jumping between 3 cars and still somehow keeping up with your pace on the highway. Not a trucker, but I had a college teammate from Miami tell a story that he swears on to this day. He and his girlfriend were making the drive to Naples last night, on a 2-lane road through the Everglades, and had been in a line of cars behind an 18-wheeler for multiple miles. She fell asleep, and he was surfing for something to listen to on the radio. Only one station came in clearly enough to be tolerable, so he gave it a listen. The DJ came on and said something along the lines of, "The stars are extra bright in Everglades tonight. If you're driving through there, pull off and take a look." He said he normally wouldn't even think of it, but for some reason felt compelled to that night. He woke up his girlfriend. She was annoyed and didn't want to, but he convinced her it would be worth it. They stopped and just looked in the stars for 5 to 10 minutes. He said it was the most amazing sky he's ever seen. They get back on the road and drive another few minutes and come across a massive accident. The truck they were following had jackknifed and took out a handful of vehicles that were following. He said there were multiple fatalities, but I've never been able to find a news story about it to confirm. Probably would have been around 2005. They most likely would have been involved if not for that random DJ on the only radio station to come in that night. You know, after hearing so many stories of people just getting a weird feeling and then basically cheating death, you gotta think that, like, maybe our survival instincts are so powerful that we can practically sense when something horrible is about to happen, even if there are no clear signs of it. I don't know, it'd be kind of interesting if they were to, like, get in contact and talk to all the other people that were in that line of cars and see if anyone else had the same feeling. Not technically a truck driver, but I used to work as a field technician in the oil industry, so I spent a lot of time driving through remote areas of Canada at odd hours. One very strange and eerie experience sticks with me. I was in either northeast BC or northwest Alberta, can't remember the exact location, driving late at night when I noticed a very large black shape on a road in front of me. Thinking it was a moose, I stepped on the brakes, coming to a stop only a few feet from it. Despite being so close and having my headlights shining directly on it, I still couldn't tell what I was looking at. It was vaguely the shape of a four-legged animal, but very big, probably about 6 feet tall. Aside from that, it's completely featureless. I couldn't make out any details whatsoever. No shine from its eyes, nothing. And then I noticed there were more of them in the ditch on both sides of the road, 5 or 6, or maybe more, all the same as the black shape on the road in front of me. None of them were moving. They didn't look like physical objects or living things, more like just large patches of absolute darkness. After I got over my shock, dread started to set in, and I drove around the thing on the road and sped off. I don't really believe this was a paranormal experience. I'd been driving for over 8 hours through the middle of the night, and I was exhausted. Most likely it was a hallucination caused by lack of sleep and spending too long staring straight ahead into the dark, but it was still a very unsettling experience. See, I'm somebody that stays up super late all the time. I have no problem staying awake, but driving down a straight highway in the middle of the night can be one of the hardest things for me to stay awake for. Not a truck driver, but I've spent the past 4 years driving every day and night for work. I was in a fairly rural part of Mississippi, somewhere between Clarksdale and Greenwood. Important note, it's all 2-lane highway, the 250-mile drive home. The weather had turned pretty sour as I was leaving Clarksdale. I called my wife and told her there was a high wind advisory and very possible tornado threats throughout the Delta, and I'd call her as soon as I made it to a safe area again. I had already been working for 14 hours when I got in the truck, so I had already eaten dinner and grabbed some coffee to stay awake and alert. Now, if you've ever driven through flat farmland at night for 100 miles, it's very fatiguing and spooky without inclement weather. I had driven maybe 30 miles out into the farmland when hail started bouncing off my truck. Being a Mississippi native, I knew in July hail meant tornado. I pull off to the side. I'm in the middle of nowhere, no lights to be seen, no cars behind me or in front of me, and start looking for the storm or tornado. I believe it's approaching. I rolled the passenger window down and shined a bright flashlight off into the night. Nothing there. I turned to the driver's side, and this guy has his face pushed against the glass, grinning from ear to ear. I screamed, and he was gone. I slammed the truck in drive and took off. We have all the time running cameras on our trucks. I got to the first safe place to stop and called my wife. I didn't want to scare her, so I didn't mention the guy or the hailstorm. I did, however, pull the SD card and check the cameras. I promise you, this guy never popped up on my front or rear cameras. I've always played it off as my imagination. I will say I don't drive in the Delta in the dark anymore if I don't absolutely have to. You know, it's actually been a dream of mine for a long time to go out into the Great Plains and just storm chase, go see some tornadoes. One of these days. I'm not a truck driver, but the story's from a truck driver. So I was working the overnight shift from Friday night into Saturday morning at a gas station. At about 6 a.m., a semi pulls into the fuel aisle. Driver gets out and almost runs into the store, clearly shaken. His face is completely white, and he is obviously upset. My first thought was the poor man had hit someone on the road. We get a lot of drunks walking across a 4-lane highway in front of the store, so I ask what's wrong. He looks at me for a second and is like, "I'm not crazy." Now I'm thinking, great, I'm here all alone and this guy is losing it. I say, "Of course not. I just saw something huge on the side of the road." "Like a deer or bear?" "We had a bear get in the dumpster last week." "No, bigger than a bear on its back legs." "Maybe a big person?" "It picked up a buck on the side of the road and carried it over its shoulder into the woods." I can only stare at him. My brain cannot deal with this information this late in a shift. A local comes up to the counter to get his usual, and a guy tells him the story, and the local says, "That's the Bigfoot that lives near the county line." The truck driver and I are both looking at this guy like he has two heads. He has to be joking. This trucker pays for his fuel at record speed and leaves, never to be seen again. The local still insists it's Bigfoot. I just don't get into the woods because I don't know. See, I think what makes the whole topic of Bigfoot so mystical is not just that people claim to have sort of seen him, but also just that nobody's ever caught one, nobody's ever found a dead one. Like, the only reports anyone has is just seeing one, like, in passing, just barely. So who knows, maybe we'll find out the great mystery one day. So my great uncle drove big trucks. Living in the middle of nowhere, sometimes people would leave trash on the road. And since he's a big truck, he'd just smash into said boxes or paper and continue on. One day he was coming up on a cardboard box, and just had the urge to swerve and miss this one. He misses it and passes by with no incident. Looks in his rear view to look at the box, and out pops a kindergarten-age little kid that just heads back to their house as if nothing happened. Okay, something tells me that kid's probably not gonna make it to the age of 18. Years ago I read an answer on a thread with this question, about a guy who was riding with his truck driver father as a child. They were in the middle of nowhere, and they were coming up on a person laying in the road with no one else around. No cars, etc. His dad blew the horn. They didn't move. He blew it again as he got closer. They didn't move. He told his son to put his head down and cover his eyes, and he ran the person over. When they looked back, a bunch of people who were previously hiding were running out of the woods, and the gist was that the dad knew it was a setup for a robbery, or worse, and wasn't chancing it with his child in the car. No clue if it was true or not, but I think about that story all the time. Well, I wonder if these criminals were smart enough to at least use a dummy in the middle of the road and didn't just sacrifice one of their guys for it. Trucker here. I think the best creepy thing that ever happened to me was I was heading from Tucson, Arizona up into Salt Lake City, Utah. Well, this was a few years ago, and the main highway had been taken out in a flash flood. Was under construction, so I had to take a weird detour through the mountains in lower Utah. Well, it was getting late, and I was getting tired, so I pulled off onto the shoulder and went to sleep in my bunk. Now, this was the middle of nowhere. Closest town was like 40 miles away, so it was completely pitch black outside once I turned the lights off. Anyway, around 4 a.m. I wake up because I'm hearing something messing with my truck. Like playing with the air and power cables between my cab and the trailer, which is literally 6 inches from where my head is at, but on the outside of the cab. Then I feel something climb onto the landing that's on the back of my truck, and it shakes my whole truck. So I'm guessing something around 200 to 300 pounds was climbing around back there. I'm thinking like a mountain lion or a bear. At this point, I'm wide awake, and I want to get this thing away from me. So I slam my hand into my cab wall, trying to scare whatever it is out there. Slam hard enough to really make it loud. I then hear someone, a male, scream bloody murder, and I hear them fall off the back of my truck. I then hear about 15 other people all around my truck yelling. I climb up front, turn on my lights, and illuminate a squad of Army reserves doing their midnight ruck march and capture drills. Turns out these guys were supposed to go find an abandoned truck and secure it for their midnight drills. That truck was 3 miles back down the road. They were not expecting me to be sleeping there and thought I was part of the drill. I'm ex-military, so after explaining I was not part of their test and legit was just there out of coincidence, we laughed it off. They had to radio to their CO and tell him I was there, and not to have the other squads bother me. Well, I guess all of you were pretty lucky that nothing drastic came out of that. Driving through rural New Mexico, Bisty area with the crazy melted rock look. No plants or anything, just rocks and sand. Monsoon time. Raining cats and dogs, just pouring so hard you could barely see going 20 miles an hour. Thunder and lightning just rocking the car. Sometimes turning into hail and pounding you. Just a nasty storm. Came around a corner and the whole countryside legit on fire. Like 20-foot tall flames, hundreds of yards in all directions while pouring rain at dusk. Just rocks and dirt wildly on fire in the pouring rain. Just slowly drove on, was totally freaky and surreal. Honestly thought I may have hallucinated it. I checked the news and a propane truck slid off the road going way too fast and apparently busted open pretty violently and lit on fire. Never saw the truck, must have been behind something. Felt a bit bad after about not stopping. I don't know, it kind of just sounds like nature was putting together some sort of stew of every element just fused together in one giant storm. Not a truck driver, but I have one weird story from when I was a kid. My parents always took us on long road trips every summer, and my dad liked to take meandering routes through natural towns to see all the tourist traps. One trip, we passed through a little town in Illinois, the kind you miss if you sneeze. This one had mannequins. Every house and business was only populated by mannequins. I don't remember seeing any people, Everything looked maintained and clean, so someone was at least caring for the place. There weren't any signs or anything indicating it was for tourists. Just a convenience store / bait shop with the sign reading, "Eat here, get worms." You know, this sounds very similar to a horror movie I've seen. I don't remember which movie it was, I've seen way too many, but yeah, maybe it was just the set of a movie or something. My uncle was driving between Great Falls and Helena at around 3 a.m. He had his high beams on as it was a lonely drive and quiet highway. In the distance, he saw something cross the median and started to slow his approach, thinking it was a deer. As he got closer, he realized it was standing up, and so he slowed down to about 30 miles an hour. He realized what it was and started to panic. A man in blue coveralls with a pig's head. Not a mask, but literally the head of a pig on his shoulder. My uncle moved to the left lane as he passed. Pig head lunged at the truck. My uncle didn't stop to check if he had grabbed on till he was in the safety of Helena. Nothing was out of the ordinary there, but on that stretch of road now, he doesn't slow down for anything. See, I think stories like this are just the reason so many people think that if you go out into the middle of nowhere or some small town that you're gonna get murdered. But I don't think this kind of thing is too common. My father told me this story maybe 1,000 times. My family, as well as a couple of uncles and my oldest cousin, went on a trip from Mexico City to Acapulco when I was barely a year old. Back home in the middle of the night, the car broke down, and a police car quickly came to our help. There were 3 policemen in the car, and the chief ordered to take my dad to the nearest gas station, where he could find a mechanic, and told the other 2 officers to stay with our car. My dad says they seemed absolutely not pleased with the order, until the chief told them, "Don't worry, there's a woman and 2 children." That seemed to calm the 2 others. Driving to the gas station on the police car, my dad asked the chief what that was all about. The chief told him that there had been many accidents in that part of the road. That's why they were able to find our car so quickly. All of the accidents involve young men traveling without female or child company. Those who had survived said they'd crashed because they could see a very beautiful woman next to the road, but once they came close to her, she turned out to be just a rotting corpse staring at them, and they crashed because they were paralyzed by fear. What? I worked at the Nevada nuclear test site, decommissioning old buildings. One of the creepiest days was when I was sent with an end dump load of non-hazmat material to the general landfill, which I had never been to before. Somehow I missed the turn and ended up in an armed gate with machine guns pointed at me. Very uncomfortable. Once I explained my mistake, I was quite hastily turned around. Still not knowing exactly where my turn was. A very nondescript desert road was what I was looking for. I headed back. I turned on the next dirt road I came to and ended up at the Sedan crater. Went and smoked a cigarette on the observation deck all by my lonesome. My hands were still shaking from the run-in with the armed guards. Another was when delivering a hazmat load to Area 25. They had begun using robots to guard the area. They were still in beta testing, and someone may have just been messing with me, but the thing perceived my truck as a threat and blocked my ability to move. I went inside the building, and 15 minutes later it had moved on. See, now I just wish I could have a video of stories coming from whistleblowers inside of government facilities just talking about all the shady stuff they're up to. Not a truck driver, but once I was driving through the Canadian Rockies late at night and had just passed through a small town. So I'm driving through the pitch black and I need to stop and pee and have a smoke. But because it's so dark, I missed the last rest stop for the next while. No problem, the highway is completely deserted, so I pull to the side of the road, have my pee while staring out into the dark, and then light up a cigarette and stand by my car. As I'm standing there, I see the figure of a man just walking out of the tree line. I'm miles from civilization, patchy cell service, and there isn't a soul on the road. I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, and maybe it was a deer, but nope, this was a man. So I calmly walk back to the driver's door and get in, locking the doors behind me. I'm keeping an eye on this guy as I nervously smoke and have my car in drive, ready to peel out, but for some reason I just stayed put. The guy walks right up to my passenger door and knocks on the window. I crack the window and ask what's up. He replies to me in a very serious tone, "I need you to call the cops." I cautiously ask why, and he tells me he had gone out into the woods to kill himself, but he couldn't go through with it because he had thought of his daughters right before he was about to do it. I called the cops while the guy quietly cries outside. He had a kitchen knife that he was going to use on himself, so I stayed in the car and advised him to maybe leave the knife on the ground before the cops arrived. The cops came and got him, but before they left with him, I gave him a solid heart-to-heart and wished him well. I still think about him. I hope he was able to turn things around. Well, that's all of the creepy truck driver stories we've got for tonight. These kind of remind me of, if you guys ever saw my videos from The Shadower, how I job shadow people. I job shadowed a truck driver and just talked to him for like a couple hours. So if you want some more truck driver stories, I guess you could go find that video. But anyways, that's all until Halloween tomorrow.